Hello, everyone. It is, uh, we're in the second to last week of November. We have like 1 week left of November, and then it'll be December and holidays and all of that. And the holiday season is already feeling like it's in full swing. And yeah, so Monday, I went to my friend's conference. So one of my friends who we, I think I mentioned him before. We went to the same high school together. I think we went to the same like grade schools as well. We were on the same bus growing up, though we didn't really know each other until high school when we started doing plays together, and we were on students council together. And then but we still, I feel like we still didn't really like spend that much time with one another because we were in different years. So, and also high school is a weird time. And then we ended up going to the same university, but also not really crossing paths too much. And then when I came here, we ended up being in the same university again, doing postgraduate studies, and we just like ran into each other in the hall. And it's been really nice reconnecting and having someone from home who kind of gets a lot of the things that I've gone through, and the wild experience of life that even though we haven't witnessed each other's lives in the interim, there's a certain understanding that I think is inherent when you are familiar with the places that one comes from and that one is close to. So for that, I've been so grateful having that in my life. And so he organized a conference at UCL on Monday, and I went. It was like all day, or it was during all of the sunlight hours. Well, maybe not all, because I guess sunlight starts at like 7:30. But I woke up and watched the sunrise a little bit, and then headed to the conference. And there were so many panelists who were all talking about their field work that they were doing. This was largely like anthropologists. Tyler's in like the geography. What is the word? All I can think of is the word sector, but that's not it. he's in geography, but looking at queer migration, and so he did his presentation on his research findings and experiences doing field work. There was someone else who was talking about like neurodivergence and doing field work. There were so many different, very like hyper-specific community kind of fieldwork studies. So like there was one in Turkey with Iranian refugees being sort of like brought into Turkish community, and some of the I don't know if I want to say some of the conservative sentiments that were going on and impacting those relationships. There was another about like marriage and divorce laws in, oh gosh, I can't remember exactly where. I want to say India, but I think it was a more specific place that is near there. And they had like multiple types of laws depending on what the judge decided would be like the most appropriate law for that case, which had all sorts of implications for the women who were seeking divorce, whether or not they would have access to their children, for instance, and things like that were just in the hands of these judges. So that was really interesting, and there were so many. There were probably about 15 different projects, and they were all fascinating. So that was just a really like intellectually stimulating day. And then afterwards we continued conversations, and yeah, it was a really, really great day. And the week before, I had gone to this event that I heard about through P Social, which is a psychedelic social, like people working in psychedelic science or with psychedelics have like a social every month. And someone had posted in the group chat for that about this cognitive security talk. And so I went to that. They talked about, how to identify manipulation and how to protect yourself from scammers and people who are going to use you and things like that. And that led to a lot of really interesting conversations with a lot of people. I ended up having like a little sit down with people who I didn't realize that, I don't think this was consciously a thing, but like intended for the conversation. But there was like a little bit at the end where the people who stayed were all like some level of autistic. And so that was really interesting, and we talked about psychedelics and how to not abuse your power as a therapist in that position. And yeah, there was a lot of interesting conversations, interesting information, and as with all of this sort of like psychological stuff, it's very like perspective shapes a lot of things, and so it's not always clear cut. Like even though things might fall under categories that seem like, oh yeah, that seems like manipulation, it's not always. And one area that we did talk about that was particularly interesting is when the person who is like manipulating you, they're not like intentionally doing it, they're maybe misleading, but it's because they believe that whatever they're telling you is true. And I think that that is more often the case in a lot of situations than not. Because it's very easy, like we have very powerful minds and we can justify all sorts of things. So this is where like you can get a little paranoid about like, is my sense of reality accurate? How do I even know that? And ultimately you can just worry yourself sick because you can't. I mean, you can, I think, if you ultimately start getting into introspection and really getting to know your body signals and what they mean, and that, even then, you're always uncovering new layers of understanding. So I think the more that I learn about the world, the less certain I am of anything. Like anything. And in fact, people who are certain of things, I'm like, oh, I don't know about you. So there was that was really interesting. And then I think I might have mentioned I had gone to like a queers in STEM social before that, but I think I talked about that in the last episode or the last video. So yeah, there's been a lot of intellectual. Oh right, and then Tuesday, before I went to work, there was a talk that my one of my professors from my master's program had a talk on low testosterone in men and the link with frailty and sarcopenia, which was really interesting. And I find that, like, I always find his lectures to be really engaging. It was a short talk comparatively to the lectures that I was used to, but it was really, like, I find hormones fascinating, and I think that there is so much that we do not know, but there's also so much that I personally don't know that others do know. So I'm very curious to learn more about that. We talked about there being a link with cortisol, there being a link with estradiol, and exposure to estradiol. Estradiol is a type of estrogen that is very frequently used in the pill, in the birth control pill. And so that's in a lot of people's systems that they're taking daily, and then that's getting, I would suspect that is probably getting into the water system and affecting people in some way. I don't fully know that. I don't know all of the details around that, but I think it's quite possible that that's going on. And then that would then influence the hormone levels, because that, I mean, everyone, the idea that there are male hormones and female hormones is a bit misleading, because we all have all of them. But similar to, so I've also been reading this book called Come As You Are recently, which is a book that one of my friends has been read like ages ago when it came out, and highly recommended it. And then I've finally come to a place where I'm now reading it, and I'm very glad that I am, because it's interesting. And one of the very first things that it talks about is how, like, every human has the same parts, it's just arranged slightly differently. And so this idea of there being rigid boundaries between man and woman is scientifically false. Like, you can kind of group people into these two groupings, but I think that that's probably just as arbitrary as if you had four groupings, or, you know, something similar. So I think looking at things as more of a, you know, how are we all the same and how are we individually different, rather than how are we divided into these two groups, and then these two groups are somehow homogenous within them. That's not really realistic or accurate. We are all individual humans, and we all have a unique sort of physiological makeup that turns us into the people that we are. So, taking that idea and then interpreting this low testosterone in men idea being linked with frailty and sarcopenia, I think all of that is fascinating, and there's a lot that I really wanted to like get into, especially looking at, like, if we, one of the elements was free testosterone versus overall testosterone, and the free testosterone levels are elevated in people with PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. And in men, having high testosterone is linked with having like more robust bones, is protective against osteoporosis, whereas I don't know, like, I started looking into the research. It doesn't seem to be a whole lot of research into elevated levels of testosterone in women, and whether or not that's protective of osteoporosis. Because the one of the studies that I looked at specifically did not include, like, they had a cutoff of testosterone that they would accept, and anyone above, I think it was like 70 like nanograms of testosterone or something like that per deciliter of whatever, yeah. The cutoff was lower than what is commonly seen in PCOS. So they were specifically getting rid of the population who we could learn the most from in this scenario. So that was not very good. I don't know why that was a thing. I don't know why the researchers made that choice. But I think it would be really helpful to specifically recruit women with PCOS, and seeing if that is associated with a decreased incidence of osteoporosis, and then maybe doing some comparisons, seeing if testosterone in and of itself is protective against osteoporosis and protective of bone strength, or if it's more complicated than that, and like more of an interplay between other hormones and other elements. There was also like another point where I thought about, you know, when you don't fit the ideal of the gender that you've been sort of given at birth, like you recognize the points at which you don't fit pretty quickly. And if you don't recognize it, the people around you do, and they make you know. So so when you feel like, oh, I'm like hormonally different from the people that I'm supposed to be like, that that discordance, like that makes you feel othered, that makes you feel like you don't fit in, that makes you feel like you're weird, and it gives you all of these like really uncomfortable ideas because our society values conformity. And so that in and of itself can lead to depression, I would think. And in the talk, it was discussed that there's a strong, already established link between low testosterone in men and depression. And I wonder to what degree that is physiological and to what degree that is psychological. Anyway, so there was a lot of really interesting things that came up this week. So there was all of that, and then so I've already been like in a very like analytical, mental space, and then there's also been like a lot of prompting for me to really go into my own sort of psychological makeup and how that is impacting all sorts of areas of my life. And through that introspection, I started really getting on this idea of expressions of anger and how that specifically is really difficult to deal with. And on a certain level, you know, in an ideal world, anger wouldn't exist. You know, like we in an ideal world, as soon as there are problems that come up, we address them immediately so that it doesn't get stored in our bodies for a long period of time, creating resentment and then ultimately anger, or deep fear and then ultimately anger. Right? So anger happens when our boundaries are crossed, or when we're really struggling to be heard, struggling to be seen. And so anger is usually like a cry for help. It's some sort of something is not being heard. But it can also be a really scary thing to experience because it means that something has been deeply problematic for a while, or something has crossed the line really far suddenly. And both of those scenarios, you know, don't make us feel good. We don't, I think humans inherently don't want to upset other people. You know, like we want everyone to just be happy, having a good time. And so, and we also have been fed this narrative of there are good people and there are bad people. And which is a false narrative. There are people, and we go through things, and that shapes us. And a lot of the time, the ways that shapes us are ways that we don't necessarily have access to fully understanding, at least not in the moment. Oftentimes, if we're lucky, if we've really been working at it, we can get to an understanding of it later on. And if you've really developed a lot of introspective skills and self-awareness, body awareness, all of that, you might be able to access that wisdom in the moment. But that's incredibly rare and difficult. So, yeah, I guess I've been thinking about anger and how when I was younger, I would see anger and I would see the reactions to it. And, you know, anger, when you're a child, you see things, but you don't really know how to react necessarily, right? You're being taught by everyone around you. And which is why, like, if you fall down and someone is there and they're like, oh my goodness, and they run over to you and they start like worried, asking you if everything's okay, looking you over up and down, like, yes, that's an expression of caring, but it also tells the child that there was something to be scared about. And then they're going to start crying, they're going to be really upset, they're going to internalize this having fallen as like a really bad thing. If a child falls and no one's there, yeah, you might cry if it hurts a little, that might happen. But only if it genuinely hurts. Otherwise, you're probably just going to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, be like, oh, that wasn't good, and like move on. And then on the other side, if you fall down and someone is there and they just start laughing and they think it's like funny, but not in a laughing at you kind of way, but like laughing like, oh my goodness, that was a lot, and like, how are you feeling, without it being necessarily a horrible thing, I think that can then switch people. Like, I remember when my younger sister was probably about 6 years old, maybe, and we were playing badminton, and I accidentally, like, or maybe it was me, maybe it was Cole, I don't remember, but we were playing badminton, and she got hit in the face, and it could have hurt. It looked like it probably hurt, but I don't know, something in me just like could not contain laughter, and I just like started like uproariously laughing. And I think that this is like, I've noticed that there are times in my life where if I'm deeply uncomfortable or concerned, I'll just start laughing. Or if it's something that like I remember when I found our dead cat. I was the person who found the body, and I was upset that the cat was dead in a way. It was like I knew what that meant, but I also didn't have like the huge attachment to life and death cycles that a lot of other people did. I saw death as like kind of a natural part of the cycle of living, but I also knew that it was kind of like a big deal. And I really didn't know how to handle that situation. So I remember walking up from the basement, walking into like the family room and just kind of laughing, somewhat maniacally probably. And I, got it out, the like cat's frozen to the floor. And, that was not great. But, we have, like, our emotions are weird. Our emotional reactions to things are bizarre sometimes. And anyways, getting back to anger, I think that when I saw expressions of anger, the response that I often saw was one of deep fear. Not because the person who was angry was necessarily actively harming or threatening to harm anyone, but that it was an intense emotion, and that intensity translated into fear. And I wonder if I could have avoided having, like today, if I see expressions of anger, it takes a lot, like particularly if it's someone that I really care about. I mean, if someone that I barely know is angry, like I have enough ability to separate myself to see that as like, oh, they're going through a thing. But if it's someone that I care about and they're angry, that triggers like just deep, deep fear and feeling unsafe and a lack of security. And it's on like a panic level. It's like it's a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And I wonder if I could have avoided having that reaction if the responses that I saw were from a place of understanding the anger is often a way that people are trying to communicate a deeply unmet need or like a boundary that's been crossed, and responding to it as like in an empathic sort of compassionate way. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have the same kind of fear reactions to anger that I do. So anyways, I've been thinking about that, and I don't know what to do with that yet. I guess continue to do, I mean, I don't know if I really talk about this much, but I spend like a lot of time thinking about my, like trying to unlearn, relearn, and understand my own responses to things, because I know that, you know, like everyone, the things that we internalize as children often were maladaptive, often were not helpful long term. And if we want to be healthy, whole adults, a lot of the work is going through and looking at what are the internalized things that I never really questioned. What are the things that I just assumed to be a natural part of life? Especially when those things are not things that are helping. So I spend like, I mean, this is part of having done an undergraduate degree in psychology and then working in mental health. These are things that I'm constantly thinking about, because I know that if you're in a role of caring, you don't want those biases to leak out and affect the people who are already in a vulnerable state. And also the idea of vulnerability has, like my idea of vulnerability has really evolved a lot, to the point where, going back to the conference, a lot of these projects really focused on like vulnerable people. And it made me wonder if projects that focused on people of privilege would be as, or maybe more powerful than focusing on people without systemic power and privilege. Because, and this is part of one of the conversations I had afterwards, was that people who have been stripped of systemic, like institutional power and privilege, often have to, in order, because that's not a comfortable position to be in, and in order to be able to cope with living like that, you have to develop your own inner sense of power. And so I think people who are often seen as more vulnerable and more marginalized people are often more personally strong than people who have more power, more privilege given by systems of institution and power. Because those people have been able to rely on external sources of power and privilege to get what they want, get what they need. And oftentimes when those ways of getting their needs met are challenged, it can be really threatening, in the way that someone who has had a really marginalized identity was threatened when they were very, very young and had no choice and had to learn and grow from it. So I guess that kind of suggests that people who were born into power and privilege likely will have to go through that process of finding their own personal power at a much later time in life, when there's less forgiveness for, you know, being a hot mess. Or less understanding about it, right? Because we expect people in their teens and 20s to be like a complete mess. You know, we expect that. And I think part of why we expect that is that so many of us have had to abandon ourselves at that time, and that process does not look good. Or we've had to confront what is challenging about the systems that don't work for us and have to like grow through that. So it's interesting thinking about how we humans, who I think the innate nature of humanity is very different from the system that we have to assimilate into. And we don't actually have to assimilate into it, but it's, well, maybe some of us do, because oftentimes we become aware of it as children when we can't meet our own needs. And we often are being raised by people who have had to assimilate into the system one way or another. So we don't really have, or often don't have, adult role models who have figured out how to live independent of this system that doesn't work for us. Some people do have parents and like are part of a lineage who has successfully like separated out of the system or worked to fight against the system, and like that's always so cool to like find people who are like that. But you know, for the rest of us, we've got to reconcile, often without guidance, this discomfort between who we naturally would be if the systems of oppression weren't in place versus who we have to kind of step into in order to survive. And how we navigate that is very individual and messy. The one thing I will say, so Trans Day of Remembrance was also the day before. And so I've been seeing a lot of posts about it and just thinking about queerness. Though I think probably not a day goes by that I don't think about queerness. But I was going through pictures. So I was on a dating app and I've set it to just queerness. And going through and seeing all these different expressions of self that are challenging gender norms and sexual norms. And it really struck me how we have finally reached a place in history where people feel safe enough that all of these different expressions are being explored. I think that's really cool, because I still remember a time, and sometimes still slip into that mentality, where, you know, there's the freedom to just be, and even if you're defiant of gender norms and roles, you know, there was always a bit of a pressure to conform. And it really didn't feel safe to be different from that. And still often I don't feel safe differing from that norm. But it makes me feel better to see other people who haven't internalized that fear and who are able to actually explore, you know, the limits of their own existence, and are, and like, even if it's temporary. I mean, everything is temporary. The idea that we are consistent beings throughout our whole life is silly, I think, because we're meant to evolve. We're meant to explore ourselves and figure out what is right for ourselves. And I think that because there's been such a suppression of whole expression of genders, right? There's been this very rigid, you know, we have a binary system, because we're resisting an imposed idea of what gender means, I think that there's probably going to be a while of it seeming like absolute nonsense the way people are resisting it, because it's been absolute nonsense the way it's been imposed. So there's like equal and opposite reactions, right? And you kind of like eventually find your center, but it takes a while, and it takes a lot of exploration of like, what are the limits, and what do those look like, and how does that feel to be all the way over here, and how does it feel to be all the way over here. And maybe that's the answer, is that people will just inhabit all of those spaces, and we will no longer think of things as being rigid, because we will think of people as unique individual beings. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. It's going to have to get a lot weirder for us to be able to heal this and get through it on a collective level. And I hope that people continue to find that confidence and bravery to continue that exploration, whatever that looks like. Okay, I've been talking for like a really long time. This was a much more cerebral video today, because I've been thinking a lot these days and having a lot of cerebral inputs and experiences. If you managed to make it through all of that, please let me know what your thoughts are on this, because it's much more interesting to hear other perspectives than to just roll around in my own. But yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I think about a lot. Anyways, I'll check in with you later. I hope you're doing well. I know that it has been a challenging time for everyone in their own ways, but I think especially like astrologically, there's been a lot going on. We're moving into Pisces in Aquarius. It was in Capricorn, now it's in Aquarius. And so that's going to leave some major changes for a lot of people. And for a lot of people, that is just beginning to happen. So all of this is interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I hope you're doing well, and stay open, stay flexible, and I look forward to seeing how you all change.